Greetings, I'm Tales of Kush. Today we embark on a journey, a cosmic voyage back in time, if you will, to unravel the story of an African civilization whose echoes resonate far beyond its heartland, the Kingdom of Kush. Nestled along the fertile banks of the Nile in what we now call Sudan, Kush was a powerhouse of antiquity, a contemporary of, and sometimes ruler over, ancient Egypt. Its pyramids, though perhaps less famous than Giza's, stand as silent witnesses to its glory, ingenuity, and profound historical significance. But the story of Kush, as we'll discover, doesn't end at Africa's edge. Now, many of you might be familiar with the Table of Nations from Genesis chapter 10. It's an ancient attempt to map the known world through lineages. And right there, among the descendants of Ham, son of Noah, we find Kush. The text names his sons, Seba, Havilah, Sabta, Rama, and Sabteka, and even his grandsons through Rama, Sheba, and Dedan. These names aren't just entries in an ancient ledger, they are signposts, clues pointing to a diaspora, a spreading of Kushite peoples and their influence across the ancient world. This biblical account invites us to ask, where did these descendants go? And that's precisely our quest today. We're going beyond the familiar narrative of Kush within Africa. We're going to trace the migratory paths, the trade routes, the whispers of cultural exchange that suggest Kushite influences in Arabia, Mesopotamia, perhaps even as far east as India and the towering Hindu Kush mountains. We're peeling back the layers of history and legend to unveil ancient connections, to see how this remarkable civilization left its indelible mark on a surprisingly interconnected world. So buckle up, because the past is calling and it has some astonishing stories to tell. All right, let's set the stage. Our story begins in Nubia, the ancestral homeland of Kush, a sun-drenched expanse primarily within modern-day Sudan, stretching along the majestic Nile River. This wasn't some fleeting desert chiefdom. The Kingdom of Kush was a civilization with staying power, flourishing for over 1,000 years, from around 1070 BCE to the 4th century CE, and with roots stretching even further back into antiquity. Think about that time scale. A millennium of continuous cultural development, political power, and societal organization. It's a testament to the resilience and ingenuity of the Kushite people who carved out a mighty kingdom in a challenging yet resource-rich environment. Their story is a foundational chapter in African and indeed world history. Now, you can't talk about Kush without talking about its colossal neighbor to the north, Egypt. Their relationship was, shall we say, complex, a fascinating dance of rivalry, conquest, and profound mutual influence. For centuries, these two Nile Valley civilizations were intertwined, their fates often linked. Sometimes Egypt extended its dominion south into Nubia, seeking its gold and manpower. At other times, most notably during the 25th dynasty, it was the Kushite pharaohs, the Black Pharaohs, who conquered and ruled over Egypt itself, ushering in a renaissance of Egyptian culture, art, and temple building. The Nile wasn't a border, it was a superhighway, facilitating both conflict and communion. Kush's wealth was legendary, and much of it flowed from its control over vital trade routes. Imagine the caravans. Gold, that most coveted of metals, mined extensively in Nubia, making its way north. Ivory, harvested from the African interior, ebony wood, dark and lustrous, aromatic incense crucial for religious rituals across the ancient world, exotic animal skins, and even live animals destined for Egyptian menageries or Roman arenas. Kush was a commercial hub, a vital link in the chain connecting sub-Saharan Africa with the Mediterranean world and the Near East. This trade didn't just bring riches, it brought ideas, technologies, and cultural practices, enriching Kushite society in countless ways. And let's not forget their military might. The Kushites, particularly those from the Kerma culture, an earlier Nubian civilization, were renowned as formidable warriors. Egyptian texts often speak with a certain respect and perhaps a little fear of Nubian archers. Their skill with the bow was so legendary that Nubia itself was often referred to as Tarseti, the land of the bow. This military prowess allowed Kush to defend its territory, to project its power, and as we've seen, even to conquer Egypt. Their armies were a force to be reckoned with, a key element in the geopolitical landscape of the ancient Nile Valley. The cultural exchange with Egypt was a two-way street, a vibrant dialogue written in stone and artifact. Kushites adopted and adapted Egyptian hieroglyphs before developing their own unique Meroitic script. A script we're still working to fully decipher, by the way, holding untold secrets. They built pyramids like those at Meroe, which, while smaller and steeper than their Egyptian counterparts, are a clear nod to shared funerary traditions. Deities like Amun were worshipped in both lands, with grand temples dedicated to him in Kushite cities like Napata and Meroe. This wasn't mere imitation, it was a creative synthesis, a uniquely Kushite interpretation of shared cultural currents. Yet despite these profound connections, Kush always maintained its distinct identity. The Meroitic period, in particular from around 300 BCE onwards, saw a flourishing of indigenous Kushite culture. Their art developed unique styles, their pottery was distinctive, and the aforementioned Meroitic script signaled a conscious assertion of their own cultural voice. They were not simply a reflection of Egypt, they were a civilization in their own right, with their own traditions, their own innovations, and their own enduring legacy. Understanding this African heartland is crucial before we venture forth to seek its echoes beyond the continent. Now let's broaden our gaze, shifting eastward from the Nile Valley across the Red Sea to the Arabian Peninsula. Our ancient guide, the Table of Nations in Genesis 10, explicitly lists sons of Kush, Seba, Havila, Sabta, Rama, and Sabtika. And then it gets even more specific, and the sons of Rama, Sheba, and Dedan. These names aren't just floating in a void, they are strongly associated with ancient kingdoms and trade centers in southern Arabia, a region famed for its frankincense and myrrh, commodities as valuable as gold in the ancient world. This textual signpost is compelling, suggesting a direct migratory or colonial link. Consider Rama. While its precise location is debated by scholars, the name resonates with ancient Arabian geography. Some identify it with regions or settlements involved in the lucrative incense trade, that fragrant resin that fueled the temple rituals and perfumed the palaces of empires from Rome to Babylon. If Rama's descendants, Sheba and Dedan, became prominent Arabian powers, it implies that Rama itself represented an early Kushite foothold or sphere of influence on the peninsula. The movement of peoples across the narrow Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the Gate of Tears, connecting Africa to Arabia, is a well-established pattern in deep prehistory and later historical times. Then there's Sheba, a name that immediately conjures images of the legendary Queen of Sheba and her famed visit to King Solomon. The historical kingdom of Saba, Sheba, was a major power in southern Arabia, flourishing from around the 8th century BCE. Its wealth was built upon sophisticated irrigation, agriculture, and critically the control of the incense trade. The Sabaeans developed their own script, built impressive cities like Marib with its famous dam, and left behind a rich archaeological record. If the biblical account holds historical weight here, it suggests a Kushite lineage for one of Arabia's most significant ancient civilizations. Parallel to Sheba, we find Dedan, another of Rama's sons mentioned in Genesis. The ancient oasis city of Dedan, modern Al-Ula in northwestern Arabia, was a crucial stop on the caravan routes linking southern Arabia with Mesopotamia, Syria, and Egypt. Archaeological excavations at Dedan have revealed a sophisticated urban center with its own script and distinct cultural features. Biblical prophets like Isaiah and Ezekiel mentioned Dedan in the context of Arabian trade, listing its merchants and its wares. Again, the biblical narrative points to a Kushite connection to this vital commercial hub, suggesting a deep-rooted presence in the Arabian trade network. Beyond these specific names, what other evidence might hint at a broader Kushite or African presence in ancient southern Arabia? We look to inscriptions, though linguistic connections can be complex and debated. We examine archaeological finds, pottery styles, artistic motifs, burial practices for parallels with Nubian or African cultures. Some genetic studies on modern populations in the region also hint at ancient admixtures from Africa, though tracing these back to specific Kushite migrations is a challenging endeavor. The intermingling of populations across the Red Sea was likely a continuous process over millennia. Ultimately, the narrative of Kush's sons in Arabia paints a picture of an ancient world far more interconnected than we often imagine. It suggests that the Kushite diaspora, if we can call it that, wasn't just a scattering, but an active expansion, with descendants establishing influential kingdoms and commercial enterprises. They weren't just participating in trade, they were shaping it, controlling key nodes and commodities. This Arabian chapter is vital for understanding the potential reach of Kushite influence beyond the African continent, driven by kinship, commerce, and the relentless human impulse to explore and settle new lands. Let's journey north now, from Arabia into the Fertile Crescent, the land between the rivers Tigris and Euphrates, Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization. Here, our biblical guide, Genesis 10, introduces a truly towering figure, Nimrod. The text states unequivocally, Kush begot Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. This is a powerful claim, a direct descendant of Kush establishing some of the earliest known cities in Sumer, the heartland of Mesopotamian civilization. Nimrod's persona looms large not just in the Bible, but also in subsequent Jewish, Islamic, and even some Christian traditions. He's often portrayed as a rebellious figure, a king who defied God, and is frequently associated with the building of the Tower of Babel, that grand ziggurat intended to reach the heavens, an emblem of human ambition, and, in the story, divine retribution leading to the confusion of languages. Whether a literal historical individual or a composite figure representing early Mesopotamian kingship and urbanism, Nimrod's Kushite lineage in the text is explicit and thought-provoking. It compels us to ask, what does this mean for our understanding of early Mesopotamian origins? Now, from a strictly archaeological and historical perspective, identifying a specific Kushite layer or direct large-scale colonial influence in early Sumer, Shinar, is challenging. Mainstream scholarship attributes the rise of Sumerian civilization to indigenous developments and migrations from other parts of the Near East. However, the biblical tradition of Nimrod is persistent. Could it preserve a memory of an early leader or group with origins traceable back to the broader Kushite sphere, perhaps via Arabia or directly from Africa? Or is Kush in this context used more broadly to denote a powerful, somewhat exotic southern or eastern origin? These are the questions that fuel debate and research. Some have looked for linguistic or cultural clues. For instance, the Sumerians referred to themselves as Sagiga, often translated as the black-headed ones. While this is generally interpreted metaphorically or in contrast to other groups, some fringe theories have tried to link this to African origins. However, such connections are highly speculative and lack robust evidence. More plausibly, any African influence in earliest Mesopotamia would likely have been through gradual migration, trade, or the diffusion of ideas rather than a direct conquest, as implied by a literal reading of the Nimrod story. The ancient world was a melting pot, and Mesopotamia was a particularly vibrant one. Think about the broader context of human migration. The out-of-Africa journey is the deep background to all human settlement, But even in later millennia, populations were not static. There were movements, exchanges, and conquests. Could the story of Nimrod, the Kushite, reflect an ancient memory of a powerful influx of people from the south, or a particularly influential dynasty with southern connections that became mythologized over time? The text situates Nimrod's kingdom in the very earliest phase of urbanization. Babylon, Erech, Uruk, Akkad. These are foundational cities in world history. So how do we reconcile the powerful biblical narrative of Nimrod with the archaeological record of Mesopotamia? Perhaps we don't need a perfect one-to-one correlation. Ancient texts often compress history, personify movements, and use genealogies to explain political and cultural relationships. The story of Nimrod could be a way of acknowledging a significant, perhaps disruptive or transformative early cultural or political impulse in Mesopotamia, one that tradition linked to the lineage of Kush. It underscores the perception in the ancient Near East of Kush as a source of potent ancestral lines and powerful rulers, even if the precise historical mechanisms remain a subject of cosmic inquiry. Chapter 4. Eastern Horizons, Kush, India, and the Whispers of the Mountains. Let's push our boundaries further east, much further east, towards the Indian subcontinent and the formidable mountain range that bears a rather intriguing name. The Hindu Kush. The very sound of Kush in that name immediately piques our curiosity, doesn't it? Could there be a genuine connection between the African kingdom of Kush, or its broader diaspora, and this remote, rugged part of Asia? This is where our investigation moves into more speculative yet fascinating territory, exploring tantalizing possibilities of ancient long-distance connections. The name Hindu Kush itself is a subject of etymological debate. One common interpretation is Hindu killer, referring to the dangers the mountains pose to people from India. However, other theories exist, some suggesting a corruption of Hindu Ku, mountains of India, while others ponder if the Kush element could indeed refer to an ancient people or influence linked to the Kushite sphere. Given the historical confusion we'll discuss later between India and Ethiopia, often used for Kush, the linguistic puzzle is deepened. Could ancient migrations or settlements have carried this name so far east? Consider the ancient maritime trade routes. The Indian Ocean was a highway of commerce long before European explorers discovered it. Ships sailed with the monsoon winds connecting the coasts of Africa, Arabia, Persia and India. We know that goods from India, spices, precious stones, textiles reached the Mediterranean world, often through intermediaries in Arabia or the Red Sea ports connected to Kush. Could Kushite mariners or merchants themselves have participated directly in this transoceanic trade, perhaps establishing outposts or communities along the Indian coasts? The evidence is scant, but the possibility is there. Then there's the challenging realm of linguistic parallels. Comparing ancient languages separated by vast distances in time is fraught with difficulty. Meroitic, the script of later Kush, is still only partially deciphered. However, some researchers have tentatively explored potential, though highly debated, links between certain African language families, to which Nubian languages belong, and Dravidian languages of southern India. These are very much on the fringes of linguistic science, often relying on resemblances that could be coincidental or due to much deeper, common ancestral roots from tens of thousands of years ago, rather than historical era Kushite influence. Still, the questions persist. What about anthropological or genetic evidence? Studies of population genetics have revealed complex patterns of migration and admixture across Asia and Africa. There are, for instance, populations in India with African genetic markers, though these are often attributed to later trade, including the slave trade. Tracing specific links back to Bronze or Iron Age Kushite migrations to the Indian subcontinent is an incredibly complex task, requiring much more detailed ancient DNA research. However, the initial peopling of Asia did, of course, originate in Africa, so shared deep ancestry is a given. The question is about more recent specific connections. So while the idea of a direct Kushite kingdom or major colonial presence in India during the heyday of African Kush is highly speculative and lacks firm archaeological backing. The possibility of cultural diffusion, trade contacts, and perhaps small-scale migrations cannot be entirely dismissed. The name Hindu Kush remains an evocative mystery. The ancient world was interconnected in ways we are still uncovering, and the currents of trade and human movement often flowed in surprising directions. This exploration encourages us to keep an open mind to the vast web of human history, where echoes of names and cultures can sometimes span continents. The Ethiopian king Ganges and the naming of the Ganges River. One of the most intriguing claims regarding Ethiopian influence in India is the story of King Ganges, an Ethiopian ruler who allegedly led an army into Asia and left his name behind. Some historical accounts suggest King Ganges may have conquered lands up to the Ganges River, influencing its name. Chapter 5. The Kushan Enigma, a Central Asian empire with a familiar name. Now let's shift our focus to a powerful empire that emerged in Central Asia and northern India around the 1st century CE and flourished for several centuries, the Kushan Empire. Its heartland encompassed regions like Bactria, modern Afghanistan, Gandhara, modern Pakistan, and parts of northern India. The Kushans played a pivotal role in facilitating the Silk Road trade and were patrons of Gandharan art, that fascinating fusion of Greco-Roman and Indian Buddhist styles. But the name Kushan, it resonates, doesn't it? Could this empire, so geographically distant from African Kush, have some ancestral connection? The similarity in names, Kush and Kushan, is undeniably striking and has led to much speculation over the centuries. Is it purely a coincidence, a linguistic accident where similar sounds emerged independently in different cultures to denote different groups? Or could there be a deeper, perhaps indirect, historical thread linking them? This is the core of the Kushan enigma. If we're tracing Kushite influence beyond Africa, the Kushan Empire, by its very name, seems like a prime candidate for investigation, at least on the surface. However, mainstream historical and archaeological consensus traces the origins of the Kushans to the Yuezhi, a nomadic people who were driven westward from their ancestral lands in northwest China by the Xiongnu in the 2nd century BCE. Chinese historical sources, like the records of the Grand Historian by Sima Qian, document this migration. The Yuezhi eventually settled in Bactria, displacing the Greco-Bactrian kingdoms, and one of the 5 Yuezhi tribes, the Gishuang, which became Kushan, rose to prominence and forged the empire. This narrative points to an East Asian, rather than African or Arabian origin for the founders of the Kushan Empire. So how can we reconcile this apparent contradiction if we entertain a Kushite connection? One possibility is that the term Kush, or something similar, was a more widespread ethnonym or toponym than we realize, perhaps used by different unrelated groups in different regions. Or could there have been earlier unrecorded migrations of Kushite-related peoples into Central Asia that were later absorbed, or whose name was adopted by the Yuezhi? This is highly speculative and lacks direct evidence. Another thought is that the name Kushan might have an entirely different etymological root in the language of the Yuezhi, its resemblance to African Kush being purely fortuitous. Some interpreters of biblical prophecy have looked for references to a Kush located in the east, distinct from the African Kush, often equated with Ethiopia in biblical texts. They might point to passages that speak of peoples from far-flung lands. Could the Kushan Empire, with its vast territory and influence, have been perceived by some in the Near East as a manifestation of such an Eastern Kush? This involves a significant degree of interpretative liberty, reading later historical developments back into much older texts. It's a testament to how potent and geographically flexible names and identities can be in ancient thought. In conclusion, while the name Kushan Empire is tantalizingly similar to Kush, the prevailing historical evidence points to an origin with the Yuezhi people of East Asian stock. The connection seems to be more of a linguistic coincidence than a direct lineal descent from African Kush or its immediate Semitic descendants. However, the very existence of this nomenclature puzzle reminds us of the complexities of tracing ancient peoples and the way names can travel or re-emerge in unexpected places. It keeps the spirit of historical inquiry alive, even when the answers aren't straightforward. Chapter 6. Title: India or Ethiopia? The great geographical mix-up of antiquity body. Let's delve into a fascinating quirk of ancient geography, a persistent confusion that directly impacts our understanding of terms like Kush or Ethiopia in classical texts. For centuries, many Greek and Roman writers seem to use Ethiopia, a term often encompassing Nubia Kush, and India almost interchangeably, or at least describe them as sharing similar characteristics and even populations. This wasn't just a minor error, it was a widespread conceptual blur that shaped how the ancient Mediterranean world perceived these distant, exotic lands to their south and east. Consider Herodotus, the father of history, writing in the 5th century BCE. He speaks of Eastern Ethiopians who lived in Asia and served in the Persian army, describing them as straight-haired and distinct from the Western Ethiopians of Africa who were woolly-haired. Strabo, a geographer writing around the time of Christ, also mentions two groups of Ethiopians, one in Africa and one in Asia. Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History, echoes this, suggesting that the name Ethiopia was even given to India at one point. This wasn't just about similar skin tones, it was a genuine geographical ambiguity. What fueled this confusion? Firstly, the limits of ancient geographical knowledge. The world beyond the Mediterranean basin and the Near East was often a tapestry of travellers' tales, merchant reports, and outright myths. Both India and sub-Saharan Africa were sources of exotic goods: ivory, ebony, spices, precious stones, strange animals. From a Roman or Greek perspective, these wonders often came from a generalized south or east, and the distinctions could become blurred. Similarities in climate, tropical, and perceived skin color of some inhabitants further compounded the issue. This historical conflation undoubtedly impacted how ancient texts were written and, importantly, how they were later interpreted. If a classical author mentions Ethiopians, are they referring to Africans from Kush, Nubia, or to dark-skinned people from India, or perhaps even a group in Arabia? This ambiguity can make tracing specific influences or connections incredibly tricky. It means we have to be exceptionally careful when reading ancient sources that discuss these regions, always asking, which Ethiopia or India are they talking about? How does this relate to our quest for Kush beyond Africa? Well, if ancient geographers themselves were sometimes unsure about the boundaries and distinctions between African Kush, Ethiopia, and lands further east like India, it creates a sort of intellectual space where reinterpretations of ancient connections can occur. It means that when we find references to Kush or Ethiopians in contexts that seem geographically ambiguous, we must consider the possibility that the ancient writer was reflecting this very confusion, potentially broadening the perceived scope of where Kushites might be found, or where their influence might extend. Understanding this ancient geographical muddle is therefore crucial. It's not just a historical curiosity, it's a methodological key. It reminds us that ancient categories and modern ones don't always align perfectly. As we sift through texts and traditions looking for traces of Kushite presence or influence in Asia, we must always keep in mind this tendency of classical authors to sometimes paint with a very broad brush, conflating distinct peoples and places under umbrella terms like Ethiopia. It adds another layer of complexity and wonder to our historical detective work. Chapter 7, title: Eastern Faiths, Apostle Thomas in India and Jesus' Lost Years. Body. Let's now turn our attention to the realm of faith and its remarkable journeys across the ancient world, specifically focusing on early Christian connections to India, The tradition of the Apostle Thomas, one of Jesus' 12 disciples, traveling to India to preach the gospel is ancient and deeply rooted, particularly among the St. Thomas Christians of Kerala in South India. They trace their spiritual heritage directly back to his mission in the 1st century CE. This tradition speaks volumes about the interconnectedness of the world even 2 millennia ago. The historical basis for Thomas's mission to India is supported by various sources, including the Acts of Thomas, an early 3rd century apocryphal text that, while containing legendary elements, may preserve a core memory of his journey. Eusebius, a 4th century church historian, also mentions Thomas being allotted Parthia and India for his missionary work. The very existence of a thriving Christian community in India claiming such ancient apostolic origins is a powerful testament to the feasibility of long-distance travel and the spread of ideas across continents in antiquity. If an apostle could make it to India, it underscores the pathways that existed for cultural and religious exchange. This established tradition of Apostle Thomas in India serves as a backdrop for considering other, far more speculative claims regarding early Christian figures and the East. One of the most persistent and controversial of these is the theory that Jesus Christ himself traveled to India during his so-called lost years, the period between his childhood and the beginning of his public ministry, which the canonical Gospels leave largely undocumented. This idea gained popularity in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, fueled by writers like Nicholas Notovich, who claimed to have found ancient texts in a Himalayan monastery detailing Jesus' studies with Buddhist and Hindu sages. Now, as a scientist and historian, I must emphasize that these claims about Jesus in India lack any credible historical or textual support from mainstream scholarship. The manuscripts Notovich claimed to have seen have never been independently verified, and the narratives often contain anachronisms or theological ideas inconsistent with 1st century Judaism or early Christianity. These theories tend to emerge from a desire to find universal spiritual connections or to fill in biographical gaps, but they operate outside the bounds of rigorous historical methodology. It's crucial to distinguish between well-attested ancient traditions, like that of Thomas, and these more modern, speculative constructions. Why do such theories about Jesus in India arise and persist? Perhaps they speak to a human fascination with bridging cultural divides, a desire to see a confluence of great spiritual traditions. They might also reflect the historical confusion we previously discussed between India and a generalized East that was seen as a fount of ancient wisdom. The allure of the unknown lost years provides fertile ground for imagination and the construction of alternative narratives. However appealing as they might be to some, they remain firmly in the realm of speculation, not substantiated history. So, as we consider the spread of ideas and peoples, it's important to differentiate. The mission of Apostle Thomas to India represents a plausible, historically rooted example of ancient connections, demonstrating that individuals and their beliefs could indeed traverse vast distances. The theories about Jesus' travels to India, on the other hand, highlight how interpretations of the past can be shaped by later spiritual or cultural agendas. Both, in their own way, touch upon India's significant role in the global exchange of religious and philosophical thought, a land that both received and profoundly influenced the world. Chapter 8. Title: Bronze Age Networks, Indus, Egypt and Nubia in a Web of Trade. Body. Let's rewind the cosmic clock even further, back to the Bronze Age, an era of monumental civilizations flourishing along fertile river valleys. We've talked extensively about Egypt and Kush on the Nile. Now let's bring another contemporary powerhouse into the picture, the Indus Valley Civilization, also known as the Harappan Civilization, which thrived in what is now Pakistan and northwest India from around 3300 to 1300 BCE. These were distinct cultural spheres, yet were they entirely isolated? The evidence suggests a surprising degree of interconnectedness. We have clear archaeological proof of robust trade links between the Indus Valley civilization and Mesopotamia, Sumer, Akkad, Babylon. Harappan seals, distinctive square stamps with animal motifs, and an undeciphered script have been discovered in Mesopotamian cities like Ur and Kish. Mesopotamian texts also speak of trade with a land called Meluch, which most scholars identify with the Indus Valley region. Goods like carnelian beads, timber, copper, gold, and exotic animals likely flowed west from the Indus, while Mesopotamian products may have traveled east. Now here's where it gets interesting for our broader narrative. Mesopotamia, as we know, also had significant trade and diplomatic relations with Egypt and, by extension, with Nubia, Kush. Egyptian artifacts are found in Mesopotamia, and Mesopotamian influences appear in early Egyptian culture. So, if the Indus Valley traded with Mesopotamia and Mesopotamia traded with Egypt and Nubia, did this create an indirect chain of connection linking these three great Bronze Age centers, the Nile Valley, Mesopotamia, and the Indus Valley? It's like a cosmic game of connect the dots across thousands of miles. Direct evidence for contact between the Indus Valley and Egypt-Nubia is more elusive and debated than the Indus-Mesopotamia link. However, some tantalizing, though not conclusive, clues exist. Certain types of beads, like etched carnelian beads or long barrel cylinder beads, found in both regions have sparked discussion. Some scholars have pointed to possible similarities in certain artistic motifs or technological innovations, though these could also be independent developments or have more complex pathways of diffusion. The challenge is distinguishing direct contact from indirect influence mediated through Mesopotamia or even common responses to similar environmental or social challenges. Think about the fundamental nature of these early riverine civilizations. They all faced similar problems and developed broadly similar solutions, managing river floods for irrigation, developing sophisticated urban planning, creating systems of writing, hieroglyphs, cuneiform, Indus script, and establishing complex social hierarchies. While each civilization had its unique trajectory, the existence of long-distance trade routes raises the possibility that knowledge and ideas, not just goods, could have trickled across these vast distances. A new agricultural technique, a mathematical concept, a mythological theme, these could travel with the caravans and ships. In the grand tapestry of ancient history, this interconnectedness is a recurring theme. The Bronze Age was not a world of isolated pockets of civilization. It was a dynamic network, while the strongest links for Kush were undoubtedly with Egypt and its African neighbors. Understanding its place within this wider Afro-Eurasian web of exchange is crucial. The flow of carnelian from the Indus to Mesopotamia and then perhaps onward, or influencing tastes in regions that traded with Mesopotamia like Egypt, shows how desires and materials could bind distant cultures. Kush, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Indus Valley were all part of this ancient, globalizing world, each contributing to and drawing from a shared pool of human innovation and enterprise. Outro titled The Enduring Echo Kush's Legacy in a Connected World Body. So what have we seen on this grand tour through time and space? From its powerful heartland on the Nile, the story of Kush and its descendants appears to ripple outwards, touching Arabia with kingdoms like Sheba and Dedan, casting a shadow over Mesopotamia through the figure of Nimrod, and perhaps even sending faint echoes towards the Indian subcontinent and the Hindu Kush mountains. The descendants of Kush were not merely confined to Africa. They were explorers, traders, and kingdom builders who played a significant role in the drama of the ancient world, weaving their threads into a much larger tapestry. This journey underscores a fundamental truth about our ancient past. Civilizations did not exist in splendid isolation. They were part of a vibrant, dynamic network of trade, migration, and cultural exchange. The Red Sea, the Arabian deserts, the Indian Ocean. These were not insurmountable barriers, but highways for interaction. Whether through direct settlement, commercial enterprise, or the subtle diffusion of ideas, The influence of Kushite peoples and their kin contributed to the rich multicultural fabric of antiquity. It reminds us that our modern, interconnected world has very deep roots. And so the legacy of Kush, particularly when we consider its potential reach beyond Africa, invites us to think more broadly about how cultures influence one another and how ancient narratives like the Table of Nations might preserve genuine historical memories, however veiled in myth or legend. The quest to understand these connections continues, fueled by new archaeological discoveries and fresh interpretations. It's a testament to our enduring human curiosity, our desire to piece together the vast, intricate puzzle of our shared past, and to appreciate the cosmic scale of human history and its often surprising interconnections. Keep looking up and keep looking back. In conclusion, the descendants of Kush played a significant role in shaping civilizations, not just in Africa, but also in Arabia, Mesopotamia, India, and even Central Asia. Some sons of Kush remained in Nubia and Egypt, while others migrated across trade networks and Silk Road connections. Sons of Kush linked to Africa, Seba associated with Nubia and Ethiopia, representing Kush's African presence. Sons of Kush with disputed locations. Havila linked to a land rich in gold. Possible locations include Arabia, India, or Africa, with strong arguments tying it to East Africa and the Garden of Eden tradition. Sons of Kush linked to other regions. Nimrod established Mesopotamian cities, proving Kush's early role in Babylon and Akkad. Rama, connected to Arabia and Indian trade routes. Ezekiel 27:22 mentions Rama. The merchants of Sheba and Raama, they were thy merchants. They occupied in thy fairs with chief of all spices and with all precious stones and gold. Additionally, the Book of Esther mentions both Ethiopia and India, showing further interconnectedness.